Imagine a young boy, born in a small medieval village somewhere in Europe. He spends his early years playing in the fields, dreaming of becoming a farmer, a soldier, maybe even a craftsman. His identity is tied to his family, his land, and his freedom. But one day, everything changes. Imagine a cold morning in medieval Europe. The sky is heavy with smoke, and the silence of dawn is broken by the distant sound of hooves and the screams of terrified villagers. Raiders storm into a small settlement, setting huts on fire, tearing families apart, and dragging young boys away in chains. Among them is a boy, no older than 12. He looks back desperately at his mother, who collapses to the ground as soldiers strike her. He tries to cry out, but a rough hand covers his mouth. That was the last time he would ever see his family, his home, his old life. In that single moment, everything that gave him identity, his name, his family, his future, was stolen forever. The journey into slavery was as brutal as it was dehumanizing. Children once cherished by their families were bound together like livestock, marched for miles until they reached slave markets in distant towns or cities. Some ended up in Venice, others in Constantinople, and many were traded across the courts of Europe like pieces of property. When the boy was placed on a wooden platform, men in fine clothes examined him as though he were a commodity. They checked his teeth, his body, his youth. He was poked, prodded, and finally purchased by a nobleman. To outsiders, this was just another transaction, but for the boy, it was the exact moment his humanity was erased. From that day forward, he was no longer a son or a villager, he was property. His master could clothe him in silk or strip him naked in humiliation. He could be fed fine bread one day and whipped the next. Every detail of his life was controlled by another person. Even his name was often taken away. Many concubines were given new names, chosen to sound more exotic or to reflect their new roles in service. Imagine losing not just your family, but even the sound of your own name, the word that once connected you to who you truly were. The psychological torment of this transformation was far worse than the physical chains. A child who once dreamed of working his father's land or fighting as a soldier now had to accept that he was something entirely different, a possession. He was forced to forget his past, to silence his memories, and to obey without question. To resist meant punishment, and punishment could mean death. Slowly, piece by piece, his old self dissolved. Masculinity in medieval Europe was tied to ideas of honor, independence, and strength. Men were expected to defend their households, to fight in wars, to lead families. But concubines were stripped of that identity. They were groomed, decorated, and reshaped into objects of pleasure for their masters. They might be forced to wear perfumes, silks, or jewels, things meant to display beauty rather than strength. Each day was a reminder that they were no longer men in the eyes of society, but tools for the desires of others. For many, this was worse than death, because it attacked not just the body, but the very core of who they were. And yet the world outside often looked at them with envy. Imagine seeing a concubine walking through the palace halls, dressed in expensive fabrics, eating rich food, surrounded by luxury. To the outsider, it might appear that he lived in comfort compared to peasants starving in the streets. But this luxury was nothing more than golden chains. It glittered on the surface, but it hid the truth. That every privilege he enjoyed was conditional, fragile, and could vanish with a single wrong word or a single change in his master's mood. He had no freedom of will, no right to say no, no way to choose his own path. His life, however grand it looked, was never truly his own. The deeper tragedy was the inner conflict he carried every single day. Somewhere deep inside, he still remembered running in the fields of his village, the smell of his home, the warmth of his family. He remembered laughter, freedom, and the dreams of boyhood. But with every passing year in the palace, those memories began to fade. He no longer knew the voice of his mother. He could not recall the shape of his father's face. Even his village, once so vivid, became a shadowy blur in his mind. The palace had erased not just his body, but also his soul, until he was left as a hollow reflection of the person he once was. This was the true loss of identity. It was not only being separated from family, it was being forced to forget that you ever had one. The concubine lived, but he was never allowed to exist as himself. His humanity was rewritten, and his memories were silenced until they felt like fragments of a dream. And perhaps the cruelest part of their fate was how history treated them. Kings are remembered in chronicles, knights are praised in legends, queens live on in stories of beauty and power. But the concubines? Their names were never written. Their lives were never honoured. They were intentionally forgotten, erased as though they had never mattered. They died in silence, leaving no legacy, no descendants, no graves that people would visit. They became ghosts in the grand halls of history, unseen, unheard, unremembered. Yet their suffering was immense. They endured humiliation, loss, and despair so that kings and nobles could indulge their desires. And while their masters' names were carved into stone and written into books, the concubines themselves were swept into oblivion. Today, when we think about medieval Europe, we imagine knights in armour, great battles, royal feasts, and castles rising against the horizon. But hidden within those walls were thousands of men and boys who lived a life far darker than any dungeon. Their chains were not always made of iron, many were made of silk, gold, and the invisible shackles of control. Their tragedy was not just that they were forced into slavery, but that their very selves were taken away from them. The story of the male concubine is not one of glory or heroism. It is a story of survival without freedom, of living without truly existing. And perhaps the most haunting truth of all is this: they were allowed to breathe, but never allowed to be. Imagine standing in the grand halls of a medieval palace. The walls are adorned with gold and tapestries, the air thick with incense, the sound of lutes playing in the background. Courtiers and nobles laugh, drink wine, and whisper secrets. To an outsider, it looks like a world of elegance and power. But if you look closely into the shadows, you will see another figure, a young man dressed in silk, head bowed, eyes fixed to the floor. He does not laugh. He does not speak unless spoken to. He moves carefully, almost fearfully, because he knows that in this world a single mistake could destroy him. He is a male concubine, and humiliation is the air he breathes. From the moment he entered the palace, he was stripped not only of freedom but also of dignity. His body no longer belonged to him. His identity as a man, defined in medieval Europe by honour, strength and independence, was crushed under the weight of servitude. He was expected to be obedient, submissive and silent. Where other men could raise their voices in defiance, he had to bow his head. Where knights earned glory on the battlefield, he earned only scars of shame hidden beneath fine robes. His existence was not celebrated but concealed, spoken of in whispers. He was at once visible and invisible, displayed when needed, forgotten when not. The humiliation he endured was not always physical. Far worse was the constant psychological torment. Each day began with reminders of what he was not allowed to be. He could not be a husband because marriage was forbidden. He could not be a father because family ties would weaken the control his masters had over him. He could not even be a true friend because trust within the palace was a dangerous game. Every relationship he formed was fragile, shadowed by fear, and could be destroyed by jealousy or betrayal. He lived in a place filled with people, yet he was always alone. Humiliation often took the form of rituals designed to break his spirit. He might be dressed in garments chosen not to dignify him, but to emphasize his role as an ornament. Bright fabrics, jewelry, and perfumes that were not his choice but imposed upon him. He was paraded before nobles like a rare possession, admired and desired but never respected. People who looked at him did not see a person. They saw an object that existed for pleasure. This constant objectification ate away at his sense of self until he no longer recognized the man he once was. The worst humiliation came in the quiet moments, when he was forced to reflect on who he might have been had life not torn him away from his home. He could have been a farmer, working the land with pride. He could have been a soldier, fighting for honor and glory. He could have been a father, raising children who carried his name. Instead, he lived in a golden prison, reduced to silence and submission. He was alive, yes, but every day reminded him that he was not truly living as a man. His masculinity, the foundation of his dignity, was crushed beneath the demands of the palace. Inside the court, he was constantly reminded of his inferiority. Even servants who scrubbed the floors had more dignity than he did, because at least they were seen as words. Curs, not objects. He was mocked behind closed doors, whispered about in corridors, treated as though he were less than human. Sometimes nobles would taunt him with cruel jokes, testing the limits of his obedience. He could never respond with anger, because anger meant punishment. He could never cry, because tears were a sign of weakness that could be used against him. So he swallowed his pain and wore a mask of silence, while inside his spirit crumbled. Survival in the royal court meant submission. He learned quickly that to resist humiliation was dangerous. If he tried to reclaim his dignity, he could be punished, exiled, or even killed. So he endured. He smiled when he was expected to smile. He bowed when he was expected to bow. He accepted every insult, every mockery, every violation of his person, because the alternative was worse. This was the cruel bargain he lived with every day. To survive, he had to sacrifice the very essence of who he was. But the scars of humiliation did not fade. They sank deeper into the soul. Over time, many concubines began to lose the ability to distinguish between who they really were and who they were forced to be. The mask became permanent, the silence became their voice, the humiliation became their identity. That was the true tragedy, not just that they were humiliated, but that they were reshaped by it, moulded into something unrecognizable even to themselves. And yet, behind closed doors, many of them carried a silent rage. They could not express it openly, but in their hearts they longed for revenge, for freedom, for even a single moment of dignity. Some whispered to each other in the dark of night, sharing fragments of their old lives, reminding themselves that once, long ago, they were human. Others clung to memories, to scraps of childhood songs or faded visions of home, as if to say, I am more than this, but with every past. Sing-year, those memories dimmed, and the palace claimed them entirely. When history remembers medieval Europe, it celebrates the power of kings, the elegance of queens, the bravery of knights. It rarely mentions the silent figures who lived in humiliation just beyond the throne room. Their voices were never recorded, their pain was never acknowledged. They were shadows in the background of history, forgotten not because they were unimportant, but because their suffering was too inconvenient for the world to remember. To live as a male concubine in a medieval court was to live without dignity. It was to be mocked, controlled, and reduced to nothing more than an object of desire. It was to endure humiliation so constant, so unrelenting, that it became the rhythm of life itself. And perhaps the most tragic truth of all is this: they did not just lose their freedom, they lost the right to be men, the right to carry themselves with pride, the right to exist without shame. They breathed, but they did not live. They smiled, but behind every smile was humiliation so deep that no luxury, no silk robe, no feast in a golden hall could ever erase it. Imagine the palace at night. The grand halls are silent, the torches flicker, and the air smells of incense mixed with tension. Behind the thick walls of stone, power is never at rest. Kings dream of conquest, queens fear betrayal, nobles whisper in corners plotting their next move. And in the middle of all this chaos, a figure moves silently, a male concubine. He is neither a noble nor a servant, yet he carries secrets that could decide the fate of the entire kingdom. His body may be owned by his master, but his mind has become a weapon in the dangerous game of politics. From the very beginning, concubines were never just ornaments of desire. Rulers and nobles quickly realized their potential as tools. They were kept close, often in the most intimate spaces of power, and that closeness gave them access to information others could never obtain. A whispered conversation overheard in the bedchamber, a secret revealed in a drunken confession, a political plan murmured in the stillness of night. Concubines collected these fragments of power, whether they wanted to or not. Their very position made them both vulnerable and dangerous. But this closeness came with a price. The concubine was constantly manipulated, forced to serve not only as a companion, but also as a spy. A king might order him to watch over rival nobles, to report conversations, to seduce an enemy ally in order to gather information. A queen might use him to test her husband's loyalty or to influence decisions behind the throne. He became a pawn, moved across the chessboard of palace intrigue with no regard for his own desires. Survival meant obeying every command, even when it meant betraying someone else. The humiliation of being used in this way was profound. Imagine being forced to smile at a noble who despised you, to flatter him while secretly listening for secrets to report later. Imagine being ordered to charm a visiting diplomat, to lower your eyes in submission, while memorizing every word he spoke. Imagine carrying the knowledge of plots and betrayals in your heart, knowing that if a single detail slipped, you could be executed instantly. Every conversation was a trap, every glance a test, every secret a weight that pressed heavier and heavier with time. The concubine was never safe. If he pleased his master, he was trusted and used even more. If he hesitated, he was accused of disloyalty. If he succeeded in gathering secrets, he was valuable, but resented by those he betrayed. If he failed, he could be whipped, imprisoned, or quietly killed. No matter how hard he tried, he could never win. In this endless cycle, he was trapped, his life reduced to a series of manipulations that served everyone except Pete himself. There were nights when he lay awake, staring at the ceiling, haunted by the knowledge of what he had become. He remembered the boy he once was, innocent and free, and compared it to the man he was now, a pawn in other people's games. He had no dreams of his own anymore. His survival depended entirely on the victories and failures of those he served. He was like a shadow moving between powerful figures, always present but never acknowledged for who he truly was. Yet despite being a pawn, concubines sometimes became the silent engines of history. Their whispered words could sway decisions of war and peace. A subtle suggestion in the ear of a ruler could change alliances, shift borders, or destroy enemies. But this power was never their own. It was borrowed, conditional, and dangerous. The moment their usefulness ended, they were discarded like broken tools. Imagine the terror of living this way, always one step away from destruction. You are told to betray a noble today, but tomorrow that noble might rise in power and seek revenge. You are forced to deliver messages that could ignite a war, but when the blood spills, you carry the guilt even though you had no choice. You are ordered to seduce and manipulate, but deep inside you feel the shame of being nothing more than a weapon disguised as a man. The court was a theatre of masks, and the concubine wore the heaviest one. He had to smile when he wanted to scream, bow when he wanted to fight, obey when he wanted to resist. Each day chipped away at his soul, replacing it with fear, calculation, and silence. His life was not truly his own, it belonged to the whispers of others. Even history forgot his role. Chronicles mention the treaties signed, the wars declared, the alliances broken, but they never mention the concubine who whispered a dangerous secret at the right time, or the concubine who was forced to deliver lies. That destroyed entire families. They lived in the shadows of power, shaping it silently, but dying nameless. Their stories were erased because admitting their influence would expose the ugliness of the royal courts. And so, the concubine's tragedy was not only humiliation, but exploitation. He was used as a body, then as a tool, and finally as a weapon. Every secret he carried was a burden. Every word he spoke could end a life. Every action he took tied him deeper into a web of politics he could never escape. He survived by obeying, but in obeying, he lost everything that made him human. Perhaps the most painful truth of all was this. Even when concubines played their roles perfectly, even when they gathered secrets, saved kings, and influenced history, their reward was never freedom or dignity. Their reward was survival, and survival itself was just another prison. So when you think of the grand palaces of medieval Europe, remember the shadows moving silently behind the rulers. Remember the young men who carried secrets heavier than swords, who lived every day in fear of betrayal, who sacrificed their dignity just to stay alive. They were never meant to be remembered, but without them, the story of power in those courts is incomplete. They were the silent victims of political exploitation, men who were forced to play a game where the pieces moved endlessly, but the pawns were always the first to fall. The palace was vast, filled with marble corridors, guarded gates, and chambers gilded with gold. Yet for those forced to live within its walls as concubines, it was less a palace and more a prison. Every door was locked, every passage guarded, and every movement watched. Outside, the world carried on with its markets, its villages, its festivals, its families. Inside, they lived in silence, unseen and forgotten, ghosts moving through corridors of power that never truly below. Ed to them. A concubine might wake to the sound of bells ringing in the city beyond the palace walls, reminding him that life continued without him. Children played in the streets, merchants shouted in marketplaces, farmers worked in the fields, and families gathered at night around fires. But for him, those sounds were faint echoes, a reminder of a world he no longer belonged to. He could not step outside the gates. He could not walk freely in the city. His existence was hidden, not because he had done something wrong, but because his very life was considered shameful, something to be concealed from public eyes. Isolation was one of the cruelest punishments. A concubine had no true family in the palace. Those around him were not companions, but rivals, each competing for favour, each willing to betray the other to survive. He could not trust them. He could not lean on them for comfort, and so he lived surrounded by people but utterly alone. His memories of childhood, his mother's embrace, his father's voice, the warmth of his siblings, became both a source of comfort and torment. With each passing year, those memories grew dimmer, until they felt more like dreams than reality. The palace demanded that he forget, but forgetting meant erasing the only proof that he had once been human. Even within the luxurious chambers, secrecy ruled everything. Concubines were warned never to speak of what they saw or heard in the private lives of rulers and nobles. They were bound by silence, carrying secrets that could never be shared with anyone. They knew of betrayals, forbidden loves, political plots, and personal weaknesses. They saw rulers in their most vulnerable states, but they could never speak of it, not even to each other. To do so meant punishment, sometimes death, and so they carried the weight of silence like an invisible chain, choking them day after day. At night, when the palace key. All grew quiet. Some concubines would lie awake, staring at the carved ceilings above, fighting the urge to scream. They longed for the sound of a familiar voice, the comfort of someone who cared for them, not as a possession, but as a person. But there was no one. Even if they cried, no one would come. Even if they spoke aloud, their words would vanish into the stone walls. Loneliness became their closest companion. This isolation twisted the mind. Some concubines began to lose their sense of time, unable to distinguish one year from the next. Days blurred into nights, and seasons passed unnoticed. Without the markers of family life, birthdays, harvests, weddings, festivals, they lived in a timeless prison. Others developed habits of secrecy so deeply ingrained that even when speaking harmless truths, they felt fear. Silence became second nature, mistrust a permanent state. The palace did not just imprison their bodies, it rewired their very thoughts. To be hidden away was also to be forgotten. While rulers, nobles, and soldiers had their names recorded in chronicles, concubines vanished from history. Their families, if still alive, might whisper prayers for them, but they never knew if their sons lived or died. For the concubine, the worst pain was the realization that somewhere in the outside world, his family's life continued without him. New children were born, old parents grew frail, siblings married and had children of their own. Meanwhile, he remained locked in the same chambers, trapped in an endless cycle of silence. Some concubines tried to fight this loneliness by writing secret notes, carving small marks into hidden corners of the palace, or humming songs from their childhood. These were acts of resistance, tiny reminders that they still carried a piece of themselves, however small, within the walls of confinement. But most of these efforts faded. Notes were destroyed if discovered, songs forgotten after years of forced silence, and the marks they carved were erased by time. Isolation also served the ruler's purpose. A concubine cut off from the world was easier to control. He had no allies, no family to protect him, no place to escape to. The palace became his whole universe, and in that universe, obedience was the only path to survival. By stripping him of society, rulers ensured that his entire identity revolved around serving them. It was not just physical imprisonment, it was psychological domination. The tragedy of secrecy was that even after death, their lives remained untold. While other servants might at least be buried with markers of who they were, concubines were often erased from memory altogether. Their names were not recorded, their faces not painted, their stories not written. They disappeared into history's shadows, not because they were unimportant, but because they were intentionally silenced. To live in such a state was to exist in a half-life. The concubine ate, breathed and walked, but he did not live. He was hidden, silenced, forgotten. And as the years passed, he himself began to believe the lie, that he was not meant to exist beyond the palace walls, that his life had no meaning outside the secrecy forced upon him. This was the deepest wound of all, the slow erosion of self, until even he no longer remembered who he truly was. Behind the glittering facade of medieval courts, behind the grandeur of kings and queens, behind the songs of poets and the chronicles of history, there lived men who were denied the most basic human need, the need to belong, to be remembered, to be seen. They were locked away in isolation, chained not with iron but with secrecy, condemned not to death but to a living silence. And perhaps the most haunting truth is this: their suffering was not loud, not dramatic, not written in blood on the battlefield. It was quiet, invisible, and endless. It was the kind of suffering that slowly breaks us so all until nothing is left. They did not die in war, but they died every day in silence. The life of a concubine was always lived under a shadow. From the moment he was brought into the palace, he understood that nothing was permanent. Favor could rise like the sun and vanish just as quickly. One day he was cherished, adorned in silks, treated as a treasure. The next he was cast aside, stripped of everything, punished as if he had never mattered. There was no safety, no stability, no certainty. Every breath he took was haunted by the possibility that tomorrow would bring his ruin. In the beginning, when he caught the attention of his master, he might have felt a fleeting sense of security. Gifts were given, meals were lavish, his presence was desired. Perhaps, for a brief moment, he convinced himself that this new life would at least protect him from hunger and the cruelties of the outside world. But even then, deep down, he knew it was temporary. Favor in the royal court was like the shifting wind, sweet today, bitter tomorrow. Rulers grew bored, nobles grew jealous, enemies whispered poison into ears. At any moment, the tide could turn. And when it did, the consequences were brutal. To lose favor was not just to lose comfort, it was to face humiliation, punishment, and sometimes death. A concubine who once walked proudly through gilded halls could suddenly find himself dragged through the same corridors in chains. He might be accused of betrayal, of insolence, of sorcery. Any lie was enough to destroy him. Because he had no voice, no rights, no allies, he could never defend himself. Guilt or innocence did not matter. Only power mattered, and he had none. For some, the punishment was swift and violent. Executions were carried out in silence, bodies buried without names, as though they had never existed. For others, the punishment was exile, cast out from the palace gates, and they wandered into a world that no longer recognized them. Their families were gone, their youth had passed, and their names were forgotten. They had no trade, no skills beyond survival in the palace, and so they drifted like shadows, outcasts in the very society they were stolen from. Even worse than death or exile was the constant uncertainty. Every night, when the palace grew quiet, a concubine wondered if tomorrow would be his last day of favour. He might hear rumours of another who had fallen out of grace, dragged away in the night, never seen again. Whispers of poisonings, secret strangulations, and sudden disappearances filled the air. The fear was relentless, and it hollowed him out from the inside. Sleep was restless, meals tasted of ash, laughter felt forced. His life was a gamble in which he never held the dice. This uncertainty shaped his very existence. He learned never to relax, never to trust, never to believe in kindness. Every smile from a noble could hide betrayal. Every gesture of affection from a ruler could vanish in a heartbeat. He walked carefully, spoke carefully, even breathed carefully, because any misstep could trigger his downfall. It was a life lived on a knife's edge, sharp and merciless. Sometimes he witnessed the fate of others like him. He saw friends, rivals, and companions suddenly vanish. One day they were laughing together in the courtyard. The next day, their bed was empty, their belongings taken, their name never spoken again. Each disappearance was a warning, a chilling reminder of what awaited him. He did not need to be told. The palace spoke through silence. Their erasure was the lesson. And yet, the cruelest part of this uncertain fate was the hope it created. A concubine could never fully give up because as long as he remained alive, there was always a chance he might rise again. Perhaps his master would remember him. Perhaps fortune would turn in his favour once more. This flicker of hope kept him obedient, even as despair devoured him. He clung to survival, not because life was kind, but because the possibility of favour was addictive, a poison that kept him chained. But survival without certainty is not truly life. It is torment. The constant fear eroded his soul. He aged before his time, not from labour, but from anxiety. His eyes grew tired, his face carried shadows, his heart beat too fast at every knock on the door. The palace did not need iron chains to control him. Fear was the chain, and uncertainty was the lock. Centuries later, history books do not tell us their names. We read of kings who built empires, queens who ruled with iron hands, nobles who played their games of power, but the concubines remain invisible. Their uncertain fates left no trace, because the world had no interest in remembering those who lived in fear and died in silence. Their instability was not an accident, it was intentional, a design of power meant to keep them weak, dependent, and disposable. In truth, the greatest tragedy of the concubine's life was not simply that he suffered humiliation, isolation, or exploitation. It was that he never knew if tomorrow would exist for him. He lived in constant suspense, as if every day were the edge of an abyss. He could be cherished at dawn and condemned at dusk. He could be kissed in the morning and killed by nightfall. No man can endure such a life without breaking inside. So when we think of them, we must remember not only their servitude, but also their instability. Their tragedy was not confined to a single moment. It was stretched across their entire existence, from the day they were stolen from their homes to the day they vanished into silence. Their lives were unstable from beginning to end, shaped by fear, ruled by uncertainty, and destroyed by forces they could never control. And perhaps the most haunting truth of all is this: while knights sought glory and rulers sought power, the concubines sought only survival. But even survival was never guaranteed. Their fate was as fragile as a candle in the wind, flickering, unsteady, always moments away from being extinguished forever.